This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. StoryBeat episodes are available at storybeat.net and on all major podcast apps and platforms. If you like this episode, please take a moment to leave us a rating or review. And please subscribe to StoryBeat wherever you listen to podcasts. My guest today, Jeff Werner, is an Emmy Award-winning director and editor of documentaries, feature films, and motion picture advertising. Most recently, Jeff produced and directed Those Who Serve, a feature-length documentary dealing with invisibly wounded combat veterans who have found themselves defendants in our criminal justice system. In 2017, Jeff produced and oversaw the editing of The Heart of Nuba, a feature-length documentary that tells a story of altruism and courage as an American doctor dedicates his life to healing a community in Sudan. That same year, he co-produced Music Got Me Here, a film about a young man with traumatic brain injury whose life is saved by music therapy. Other documentaries Jeff has either produced or edited or both are The Laughter Life, that profiles the popular Mormon sketch comedy group Studio C, Free Spirits on ESPN, which won an Emmy as part of the 30 for 30 series, Becoming Bert Stern, which covers the life and works of famed photographer Bert Stern, The Woodmans, about the famed family of artists, The Other City, stories about the AIDS epidemic in Washington, D.C., Kicking It with Colin Farrell, Second Chance Season, the Nick Young story, and Mario's story. Jeff also co-directed the documentary Camp Scott Lockup for MTV, as well as two documentaries for HBO, The Godfather Family and Bloodlines, the latter having been nominated for a Cable Ace Award. His editorial work on The Mirror Has Two Faces marked the fifth time in which Jeff collaborated with the legendary Barbra Streisand. He's also the winner of several Hollywood Key Art Awards for his work in motion picture advertising. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a great privilege for me to have the multi-talented Jeff Werner as my guest on StoryBeat today. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hi there.
Well,
Very kind of you.
Oh, well, it's very kind of you to be here with me, so I thank you. So let's go all the way back to your roots. What were your earliest inspirations and influences? What was your first creative love, and how did that lead you to being in the motion picture industry?
I think initially, I think there were a couple of things that came together in a kind of a nexus. As a young person, I was very interested in sports, and as a very young child, I saw the film on television, the Jackie Robinson story.
Right.
And that kind of put together two things that became part of my interests as I grew up, which were sports, movies, and in this particular instance, political issue. So I find myself, I look back, I think I could say that as the years went by, there were films and sometimes films that involve sports, but films that involve politics and sometimes sports that kept me energized as I grew up.
So you find in looking back that there's been a theme to the work that you've done, though you didn't set out with that theme in mind.
Not at all, and I obviously had no idea because when I saw the Jackie Robinson story, I was moved by it, and I was taken by the politics of it and also the sports of it. But I had no idea that they were all actually things that you could put together into a career or a business or anything else. It was just the love of and the interest in and feeling moved by the film and then by the actual issue itself.
And that was a documentary on Jackie Robinson, not a narrative feature.
It turned out to be an actual feature film that they made, narrative film made with Jackie Robinson acting as himself. It was horrible. I mean, if you saw it today, you would not believe, because he's not an actor. He was a great ball player, but he's not a great actor. No, he played himself, and it had all the the heart tuggings of a very kind of schmaltzy film. But as a kid, it was riveting, and it hooked me.
Well, clearly you're focused most of your career in documentaries, though you have definitely sidetracked off into narrative work as well. Was it something like Jackie Robinson back then that attracted you to documentaries, or did you see a documentary and go, wow, that's for me?
No, I would say that there were films along the way that the film Battle of Algiers, which has a documentary type of style to it.
Sure.
Portopova's film was a film that really affected me as a young teenager. Same thing with Z, the Costa Gavras film,
Yeah.
as I was in college. All along, there were films that got me, and they very often had a kind of a documentary tone or sensation to them. But I basically wound up being a school teacher after I graduated college.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught elementary school and got my master's in education in New York. I taught up in Harlem on 127th Street, and was one of the great experiences of my life. And I think that time was in the 70s, early 70s.
Right.
And I was politically activated and politically motivated. And so I think I initially got into film. I know I initially got into film actually for political reasons, hoping to actually make films like Z and Midnight Cowboy and Easy Rider and the films of that period.
So the political part of motion picture storytelling, whether in documentaries or narratives, is really where your heart was.
Why I actually finally moved from San Francisco, where I was living, and I'd been living in New York when we moved to San Francisco. That's why I came down to Los Angeles, was to get into film, to try to, and you have to picture this was 1972,
right,
73, so it was the height of sort of the golden age of filmmaking in terms of The Godfather and Clockwork Orange and a lot of seminal films. But also they were making films about things, about issues. Sunday Bloody Sunday was about homosexuality and stuff. So it was in the air. People were making films about political issues.
You're not saying that the movies that the studios are releasing today are not about things, are you?
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that particular time was particularly.
Go ahead and say it, because they're not making movies today about anything.
Sometimes they try, sometimes they do, and along the way. But it was one of those. That period was, a great period for sort of innovative filmmaking and filmmaking that spanned so many different kinds of human experiences. You also had the new wave from France coming in from the 60s, and so there was a lot of ferment in the motion picture.
I think without question, the 70s were one of the great periods for art and for movies in particular in the whole long history of Hollywood. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So many incredible movies came out of the 70s. All right. So you moved from San Francisco to LA to get into the film business.
Right.
Did you have connections at that time? Did you know what you were doing?
I didn't. I had started writing a script when I was a school teacher in New York. I continued writing that script and finished it in San Francisco. And I gave it to somebody who knew Douglas Sirk. Douglas Sirk was a director in the 50s of a lot of melodramas. I said, would you give it to Douglas Sirk and see what he says about this script? And he did. And Douglas Sirk said to him, don't ask me to read this, please. I do not want to have to read this and tell you how bad it is. And just tell the guy to stay with whatever he's doing. Tell him to forget about going to Los Angeles or getting involved in film. And I persevered, and finally he did read it. And he said, this is sort of interesting. There's something there. So I was encouraged enough to think that maybe I could go down to Hollywood and try to get a job.
So Douglas Sirk didn't blow you off then?
Initially totally, but then after he read the script, he was very kind in terms of a critique, and it was positive, basically, of what I had written. And what I'd written was, if you were to read it now, it was just a ridiculous political track that was silly. But he saw some, I guess he saw some promise. So my wife had an uncle who was an accountant, and he did the books for a graphic design house in New York. And he called that graphic design house and said, do you know anybody who might need somebody to start out in Los Angeles? And they told my wife's accountant uncle about a trailer house that made trailers in Los Angeles. And I went down and interviewed at that trailer house run by a guy named Andy Keene, and it was called Kaleidoscope, and it was one of the foremost, tiny but foremost trailer houses at that time in Los Angeles, and it made trailers for all the studios.
Did you learn how to edit there?
I did. I actually I went there. I met him. He said, "I tell you what, you can be a messenger. Maybe I have a messenger now. I'm going to move up to an assistant, and but let me talk to him about being the assistant, and go get a cup of coffee and come back." And I went and got a coffee. I came back, and he said, the messenger kid didn't want to be the assistant because he didn't tell me at that time, because the editor he would be assistant to was an insane person. And so he said, but so if you want it, you can have, the job as his assistant, and you'll learn all as you go along.
But left out that you're going to be the assistant to an insane person.
True. And it was a blessing and a curse at the same time, because it turned out that he carried a gun. It was very weird. He carried a gun, but he was also an entrepreneur, and he wanted to open up an Indian jewelry store on Santa Monica Boulevard. And he had bought the place and asked me to come on weekends to lay flooring for him in the store. And I did it because I feared for my life. But because he was so all over the place, we were doing the campaign for The Sting with Paul Newman and Robert Redford, and we had cut a trailer, and we were going in to mix the trailer in the sound mix, and he didn't show. And so I was left there I was the only one who knew anything about the cut itself and the footage. So I was left there to produce the mix, and he consequently therefore got fired, and I got to take over his place as an editor.
So I want the listeners to be very aware of what is happening here, which I find fascinating. The way into Hollywood is to marry someone who has an accountant uncle who knows someone who might be able to refer you into a job you really had no intention of doing in the first place. This is the way into Hollywood. I guarantee you most people, well, I don't guarantee it, I know it, most people have similar stories to this.
Yeah, and I think also part of it, and this is true with other people I've talked to who've been in the business for a while, is while it's happening, you have no idea, you have no plan, you have no sort of grand scheme. You just it all just sort of evolves.
It happens.
And it happens, and you're not aware of it happening necessarily until you look back at it.
It's links in a chain that you look back on later and go, I see this connected to that, to that, to that, but you didn't set out to make that fence. It just happens that way.
Exactly.
I think most careers are like that. I think there are very few careers that are contrived. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that once you establish yourself, you can do a little contriving of a career, but it takes a while to get there.
Yeah, and I think that's way up there. I think for the most part, it's
catch as catch can.
Catch can, and you're very happy if you can catch.
Absolutely correct. So were you watching docs back then? Were you studying them?
No, I had I think that I had an appreciation for documentaries, and I did watch them, and Maisley Brothers and others. But I think pretty much I was hoping to go in and become somebody who made films. I was hoping to become part of that 70s wave of filmmakers who were making films about issues or things that mattered, kind of. And so I was hoping that the trailer business would be a good beginning, starting, and then it would lead to something else.
Well, yeah, well, of course it did ultimately, didn't it?
Yeah, it did.
So, all right. So when you are, when you're telling a documentary, because we'll focus on documentaries for a little bit first before we get into other kinds of storytelling, you are a storyteller. It's not any different than telling a narrative, except that you don't have a script before you start, correct?
It depends on the kind of documentary, but yes, I mean, if you're doing a non-narrated documentary, because usually if you're doing a narrated documentary, there is the narration that's been written that has pretty much become like a script, and you follow that narration.
And so you set it up like any production. You seek out specific people at certain times, and you meet them and shoot them at that point.
Somebody has done the research for writing the script, and so when they say in 1942 Jack entered the army, and met his fiance, you know that at that point you're going to have to go to the fiance and have her, be interviewed. Um, I can backtrack to say that in terms of storytelling, one of the advantages I found in terms of my career, in terms of starting with trailers was a great way to learn storytelling.
Because you could tell a story really fast, couldn't you?
You had to tell it very quickly, but you tell it, and I'm a believer in the sort of classical 3-act structure.
Mm-hmm.
You have to actually, and we had 3 acts basically to the trailers. They were a little bit longer in the 70s. They were around, I think, 3 minutes was what they run, and now I think they're 2 minutes. But you did have a beginning, middle, and end to a trailer. And we were also, as the film industry was changing, the motion picture advertising world was changing. So you no longer had the old kind of thing like Bing Crosby, Bob Hope together again in Road to Morocco. You didn't have that kind of billboarding narration anymore. It was a transitional period in motion picture advertising where things became more subtle and sometimes even without narration, which was unheard of prior.
Mm-hmm.
So you wound up having to actually tell the story sometimes without anybody saying Sue was a housewife in Long Island. You had to actually create that visually and with dialogue. And it was a great learning experience of how to, in a very brief time, try to tell a story without giving it naturally away.
So what would your first steps be then? Because this is very interesting to me, because you are actually trying to encapsulate the tone and the story and the characters and so on in a very brief period from this very large work that you have of whatever it is, 110 minutes, 120 minutes. What's your first step? What do you do aside from watching the movie, obviously?
That's the great thing about it, is that you do have that 90-minute or 100-minute film. And with that 90-minute, 100-minute film, you have to look at it over and over again and break it down. And by looking at it over and over again, breaking it down, you see the building blocks to the emotions. You see the building blocks to the suspense. You actually get to do sort of a biopsy of the film. And if you're working on a film like The Sting or The Exorcist or whatever, these are really wonderful filmmakers. So you really are learning from the best, and you're able to use that later on. If you go on to make feature-length films, you're able to use all that knowledge you've learned from by breaking down a motion picture into different parts.
It's a little bit like reverse engineering, isn't it?
Yeah. And so as a result, in terms of telling the story in 3 minutes, you kind of take your guide from what the film does, and very often you can kind of synopsize the film in 3 minutes by taking the key moments that you're actually now been able to extract from the film, because you have the entire film in front of you, and you can check even the delivery of the line that you think is a really good delivery. You can see how long they waited to deliver the line and see whether that's a good amount, or for your purposes maybe not, but you learn a lot about that. So I would say those were great learning things for me in terms of getting involved in feature-length films and narrative, as well as documentaries. In terms of documentaries that are not written as with narration, basically the editor pretty much writes the documentary.
Well, the editor of a feature-length narrative story is the last writer on the movie anyway, correct?
Pretty much. I mean, the director has his director's cut, and so he'll have the final, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. But in a case where you have no script and you've had somebody out in the field shooting, for 3-4 months, a documentary, when you get the footage back in as the editor of it, and as a director, you can also obviously shape it as you're shooting it, because you decide what you're going to shoot. But the editor gets to decide, I want to open in the church. I think, even though it's not the first thing they shot, or no,
Right.
I want to open in the church and I want to hear the choir, and then introduce the fact that the mother who's there, her son is in jail, and not start out in the jail and meet him. Or whatever it is, I had this film that I worked on called Go Tigers, which is a documentary that was at Sundance. And it's about a small town in Ohio, Massillon, Ohio, that has a crazy love for high school football. They have a great high school football team. They have a 30,000 seat AstroTurf stadium for the high school.
Right.
any case, there were many ways to start the film about that season, and but we started it, and just it's like writing, fade in. There was a scene of a baby being born and put into a cradle in the hospital. Um, we had shot a newborn baby, because every newborn baby in that town, if it's a boy, gets a little football, pee-wee football.
Wow.
So I decided that's how we'll open the film, is the baby being put down and a little pee-wee football in there. Nothing to do with anything, the hospital never played another role in the film. It's got nothing to do, we don't follow that kid, nothing to do with it. It's just how we opened the film. So you do get to basically start to tell the story as you're editing it.
So all right. So that's a great question then. When you're working on a movie that obviously you had some kernel of an idea of what you wanted to tell in the movie, you didn't just show up in a town and start shooting people on film. You had some thought in mind as to what story you were trying to tell. What are the important steps when you're developing a story like that before you go into production? Because you don't want to waste a lot of time and money if you don't have to. So how do you develop something like that? What are the steps that you take?
I think it's safe to say you have to be much more disciplined, or you used to have to be much more disciplined in terms of shooting, because stock was so expensive.
And now it's all digital.
It's so digital, and you can shoot forever and nobody will say boo. But in the older days, way back when, it was a consideration. So you really had to be very careful what you shot. The decision-making process very often, in this particular instance, for instance, I wasn't interested so much in the football, though the football was interesting because it was a extreme instance of fandom. But what was interesting was they spent so much money on the football in the football stadium that the school itself was going under disrepair and was having disrepair problems. So they didn't have books. It was just like they were spending all their money in the wrong places, and the state was going to take over the school district. That's what was sort of interesting to me. And so it really was about kids and their families rather than about the football season, although the football season became the framework of which we told the story. So there was a big election at the end of the football season as to whether they would pass a levy to help the school district or not.
All right, so you went there with a goal in mind. You knew what you were trying to get to. How frequently have you worked on movies where you set out with one goal in a documentary, but you wound up finding that it was actually something different?
That's the great thing about making documentaries, I have to say. One of the reasons why I actually got into documentaries instead of narrative filmmaking was, number one, you're always able to shoot. You can be shooting all the time. There's no makeup, waiting for makeup. There's no lighting. You basically can shoot and figure it out as you're going along and in the edit room. And that's a really engaged way of filmmaking, I find. You're constantly engaged and you're trying to constantly figure out, how does this affect the actual story I'm telling, or the issue I'm telling, or the character we're following? And it keeps you on your toes, and it's wonderful. I would say that I had done a film called Mario Story, about a young 16-year-old boy who was serving a double life sentence for a murder he didn't commit. And we had been shooting for a long time because he was trying to get a habeas petition to have the conviction overturned. And we were waiting for a decision from the appellate court. And I was cutting at the same time while waiting for this decision. And I was at my Act 2 finish, which was going to be submitting this habeas petition to the court. And we wouldn't know what happened. In Act 3, you would find out what would happen to the habeas petition. As I'm cutting it, it turns out that the kid gets stabbed in prison and
Oh, wow.
and is sent to the hospital and survives. And so that has to be in. And that's probably much more part of Act 2 than it would be Act 3. So I'm recutting the story as we're going along to bring this stabbing into Act 2 and finding a place for the appellate court appeal earlier. And then it turns out that they're going to hear his petition. So Act 3 becomes a whole other different act. And we still have to film it. We had to still film it. And it created a whole different ending to the film, as well as a different second act for the film. So that's part of the excitement of filmmaking like that, because you're constantly rewriting and catching up. It's also, if it doesn't happen, sometimes nothing happens and you wind up without third act to your story. And so you
And
can't
what
do
do you
anything
do?
about that.
What do you
But
do?
you try to craft as best you can editorially some kind of resolution to what you've set up.
So you're following the 7 basic plot points that all narrative stories follow.
I try to.
And so that was my question from earlier, which is exactly what I thought the answer would be, which is that you're telling a story just like a narrative storyteller would tell a story, like a fictional storyteller would tell a story. And in fact, I teach my students that, when the news comes on at night, which is really documentary filmmaking, basically, I say to them, what do they call those things that they're about to tell you? They call them on tonight's top story. It's always a story that you're being told. And we as humans are used to receiving stories in a certain way. And that's how you must do that in documentaries as well, or you risk having the audience be very confused.
Right. And I think also documentaries have changed a lot in the sense that they're no longer documents. They're really movies. They're motion pictures.
They're put
Like,
together.
yeah, they're put together, and they do tell story, and they do have characters, and they do have very often sort of classical moments of drama and emotion and success and victory. So they're not, very often, particularly, from the 50s, a lot of the documentaries you would see would be very much more like industrials or just very much more academic. Documentaries now are just like motion pictures.
So when you're setting out to make one, somewhat, I assume, who the characters will be in the story, but you're going to discover other characters along the way. And in a sense, you have the ability to cast on the fly. And I guess, do you call it casting when you figure out this character is really your antagonist and this character is your protagonist? Are you casting it that way at that point when you're cutting it?
And when you're shooting it, I mean, you try, I think, or at least I try as much as one can to try to find the characters that you think are going to be, are going to tell the story that you want to tell the best. And very often, it doesn't turn out that way, as you just mentioned. I mean, you'll have a character that you're following, and they turn out to be less interesting than a tertiary character that you might have actually been filming but not concentrating on. But then it turns out there's something very interesting about that character that tells your story better than your original, protagonist.
Right.
But yes, you do have a protagonist, and you do have relationships that you're trying to build, and typical traditional narrative storytelling.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. And I think that that's what makes it compelling, is that you're telling a story that people can
Right.
sort of go down that rabbit hole and get lost in. I assume you're also looking for conflict. It doesn't have to be violence, but it has to be conflict of some kind.
Absolutely. Obviously you want some kind of drama. You want something to happen. That's one of the death knells of, cinema verite documentary filmmaking, is that you start out, as you were saying, on the fly, you're creating. It may not happen. Stuff may not happen. And
Yeah,
when it doesn't happen, you can't write it, you can't create it. You don't want to, you don't want to recreate something that didn't actually happen. So you're really in the hands of fate, and you just hope from experience that you've chosen the characters that are going to sustain, and you've chosen a storyline that's going to sustain. But very often you'll find that you'll take a storyline that, for instance, we did this film called Kicking It, and we had it's about homeless people who play this street soccer in a tournament every year. It's actually a World Cup of 52 nations put together, homeless people in teams, and they play this kind of favela street soccer.
right.
It's only 5 on a team, and it's played with like a hockey rink kind of situation. And we had an American team that we were following, and we were also following a British team and an Irish team. It's not a British team, but an Irish team and a Spanish team, and a team from Kenya and a team from Russia. And we were going to focus on the American team. And we had a character who was an angry kid, and we thought he would be a perfect guy to follow. And as it turned out, he stayed angry. There was no there was no resolution to his character. There was no arc to his character. He just was an angry kid, and so his part in the film became less. And the young Kenyan who had hoped to become a professional soccer player, but who worked for a living in Kenya, but was still homeless, was a much more interesting character and became more of a character.
I'm just curious. Was this shot on video? This movie?
Yes.
And was Mario's story also a video movie?
Yes, Mario was video as well, although it was a film print because at that time when you entered festivals, you had to have a film print.
Sure. The reason why I ask is because you said earlier that you were cutting at the same time, but you're out of Hollywood. You're not in your home. You're on the road.
It depends. I mean, Mario's story was shot here in Los Angeles, so I had an edit room and shooting here at the same time.
I see. So you were actually shooting and going into a legitimate editing room. You were not on the fly working off of your computer.
Correct.
Your laptop, which people will do today.
No, right. Yeah, no. It was a full editing room.
Because today you can just fly digital footage into your laptop computer and cut on the road.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you're saying that this was actually going into a legitimate bay of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, we had an edit room because basically particularly something like Mario's story, which took place over 7 years, we were, not always shooting. We were like shooting and then not shooting, and there would be a court case, and they would have a hearing at the court, or there'd be a church service or whatever it was. So it was sporadic shooting. But at a certain point on that particular film, we had stopped and had pretty much decided what the film was going to be until we had to reopen it because he got stabbed and he got to have a hearing, which eventually freed him. So we had a whole other ending to the movie that we didn't have, months before.
So do you have a rule about how much footage you need to capture in order to make a movie, or do you just shoot until you've got it all?
When it was filmed, you really tried to do about 10 to 1. So about, 10 hours for 1 hour. That because you didn't have a lot of money. There was, if you could do more, you would do more. But that was sort of a minimum ratio. Now you just can keep shooting. I mean, it's great because you just can shoot and shoot and shoot, and you can shoot late at night. You can shoot, with light, without light. So if something's happening, you grab your camera. You can be shooting right away. And even if it's you shoot for 2 hours and an hour and 52 minutes of it is no good, you do have 8 minutes of golden stuff, perhaps.
And you have both the ease and at the same time the terror of knowing that you're going to put it together in post with whatever you have, because you're not contriving to shoot setup shots.
Right. And you do know you have the ability as you're going along. You do, the director's job is obviously to realize I'm missing somebody explaining or giving us insight into whatever it might be, the difficulty of being incarcerated. And so you do have that in the back of your mind that you don't have that on film yet, or you haven't filmed that yet. You haven't gotten that yet. And so you do have that ability always to go and shoot either a warden or a guard or an inmate or just, B-roll, just footage of what it's like to be alone in a 8x6, cell.
Sure. So for those listeners that don't know what B-roll is, explain B-roll.
So in roughly when you're doing documentaries, you have interviews with people that are crucial to your storytelling, and then you don't want to be on them all the time, hearing them talk and seeing them talk. So very often you shoot illustrative footage that helps explain or heighten or intensify whatever it is they're talking about. So you might shoot a long empty hallway in a jail cell, in a prison, while somebody's talking about the loneliness of being in jail. And that shot of the long empty corridor is your B-roll. or somebody who, who's in batting practice. If you're doing a baseball film, and somebody's talking about hitting a 90-mile-an-hour fastball, your shot of the guy hitting the ball in the batting cage is your B-roll.
Mm. You obviously spend a lot of time out of your house when you're shooting. You're not going to a set. You're actually going to real places. Is this a cost consideration that you're going to spend time in hotels, motels, on the road, eating out, and so on? Is that a big problem for a production budget?
Yeah, that's probably your biggest, except for your post-production, that's probably your biggest cost is hotels, airlines, transportation,
Mm-hmm.
meals, per diems. You're able to shoot, they're making $2 million documentaries now, but you can also make a documentary for $200,000.
Or I
or
would
even
think
less,
or even less. I was going to say
or even less.
students can make them for next to nothing.
But if you're gonna fly to Russia, and if you're gonna fly to Kenya, and if you're gonna go to Barcelona and stuff, you're gonna need to spend a certain amount of money on travel and hotels, and so that's really where a lot of your cost is. If you're doing a domestic documentary, you can stay very comfortably in a little motel and not spend very much money on that, and your costs obviously will be kept down.
Well, I would think that Michael Moore probably spends a lot of money these days to make a movie.
Yeah, and I think they're all. If you look at them, they're all. Again, I mean, if the post production is very expensive, the actual editing and the stock footage, and that's all footage that you might buy from someplace, historic footage you might buy from someplace. Those are expensive. The music rights are expensive. That's a lot of where your costs are going, because the actual shooting of a day is not very expensive, and obviously the digital footage is not very expensive.
How much are you going on the road by yourself, or do you always have a crew of some kind?
Usually we always have a crew, but the crew is small. It's a cameraman and a sound guy and maybe a PA. So it's a fairly small crew.
And you
and me. This last film that I shot, I was the sound guy, and I was the camera guy, and I was the PA. And that's just because it's a film of, as you had mentioned, about these veterans who might find themselves in the criminal justice system. And it was here in Los Angeles and down in San Diego. And I had to be very fluid, and I had to be available at a moment's notice. And not to mention the fact that I didn't have the money particularly.
right?
I did a fundraiser on Kickstarter for the post-production, because as I said, the post-production is always where your costs are, but it was just my own blood, sweat, and tears that went into the actual shooting of it. So I would stay in a motel down near San Diego, and it wasn't an expensive production.
But the machinations of making a documentary budgetarily pale in comparison to making a studio style movie. You're talking about peanuts by comparison, correct?
Peanuts by comparison, exactly.
Right. So, Eric, as a documentary artist, which is what you are, what do you find is most fulfilling about that process? What do you really love about it? Because it's got to be grueling work at the same time.
I mean, the grueling would be one word for it. The exhilarating is the other part of it, because, as I said before, you're constantly making movie, which is wonderful, which is what you want to do. I mean, when you're a filmmaker, what you want to do is you want to be shooting, and you want to be cutting, and you want to be looking and recutting and reshooting and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I mean, the fun of documentary filmmaking is that you can constantly, you're not waiting for anything. And very often you're not waiting for a studio to approve the script. You're not waiting for casting approval from somebody above. It's pretty much what the filmmaker wants to do. So for that, it's very rewarding. The other aspect of it, which I really do enjoy, and is one of the major things about it, is that you learn something. Every film you're doing that's a documentary, you're learning about that subject.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I've done a documentary about martial arts in film. I learned all, and I don't remember a lot of it now, but I learned all about Hong Kong martial arts films and all the martial arts artists and the things that I would never have known about. And
are you talking about Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan and that kind of?
Yeah, but even further back and the temple where they practice their martial arts in China, and just so many things that whatever it is about, if you're dealing with something that's involving high school budgets, you learn about high school budgets and about passing a levy to increase funding from the state, and so many different things that you can actually wind up learning about, that I find to me, that's very exciting. You can learn about homelessness, and you do a film about homelessness. I'm doing a film about habeas petition. I had no idea about a habeas petition until we did Mario's story. I had no idea about this issue of veterans in our criminal justice system and what's involved in it, and how the PTSD gets involved in it, and what are the figures in terms of returning veterans who are suffering from PTSD. There's so much stuff that you learn, and that's exciting.
So you have to be a curious person to be a documentarian.
I would say it helps. It really helps.
I would think it would. I would think if you're incurious, it probably would be torture, because you're always having stuff thrown at you that you don't care about. That would not be good at all. Do you have a particular documentary film that you think is the best exemplar for people that may not know about documentaries well, that they should go look at?
There's so many different kinds that are so good. I mean, Grey Gardens is a great documentary.
Fantastic.
The Salesman is a great documentary about a Bible salesman in the South. Altamont.
Give Me Shelter.
Give Me Shelter was a great documentary. There are many. So, but those are some of the older ones. More recently, I thought the what's it called, Honeyland? Is that what it was called recently, last year?
Don't know that one.
It's a bizarre film, but interesting, about a woman who grows honey in, I believe it's Romania. But there's so many. The Yes Men was a good one. A Thin Blue Line was good. There are lots.
All right, so let's get off of docs for a moment and talk about the process of editing, because you have spent a lot of your time as an editor, professional editor, doing all kinds of different things. For the uninitiated, define for me what an editor is, what an editor does. What is the purpose of the editor?
Yikes.
Big question, huh?
Yeah.
Walter Murch has written a whole book about it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, in a way, you are the independent eyes and ears for the director. The director is very close to the film. Having read the script, worked on the script, and then gone into rehearsals, and then the shooting days, and then the dailies. You're a fresh eye and ear when the dailies come in to the editor, and so you need to be helpful to the director in terms of being that kind of objective, fresh eyes and ears as far as performance and the scene itself. You basically get to interpret the script, because you have a shooting script when you do a narrative film. You have a shooting script that says, straight up, college campus, Professor Jones runs across the yard. Mm-hmm. You get to decide, because you know that you have a wide shot, you have a close-up of Professor Jones, you have a close-up of his feet. You get to decide how you want to open that film in your editor's cut. And so you're interpreting the script, and you're interpreting what you think might appeal to your director, and then what also you enjoy, because you get an editor's cut.
While forming a story.
While telling the story. Each scene is a story in itself. You don't want a scene that doesn't actually go someplace,
right,
and doesn't add to the overall story. So you may decide to open the film on the close-up of Dr. Jones's feet as he runs, and only reveal that he's on a college campus at the very end. And that's your story. Somebody's running. Those are his shoes. Here's his face. I have no idea where he's going or what he's interested in. Oh, it's a college campus. He must be running to class or something. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of like what an editor gets to do. It's really kind of a bridge between the script and the director with fresh eyes. I always think of the director as being the first audience of the movie, but they're seeing it in little tiny pieces of time, as Jimmy Stewart once coined that phrase, little pieces of time. Mm-hmm.
But you then are not only the second major audience, but then you help to be the essential underpinning of what the audience is going to see, you and the director.
Yes, basically, you are going to also. I mean, in terms of, you had said it before, you're kind of like a secondary writer of the
You're
film.
you're the last writer. Nobody's going
Right,
to write it after it's finished.
right. And so if you decide that the scene with the mother is much better 20 minutes earlier, that's something that you decide to do. And if it does work, it stays. And if it doesn't work, it changes. But you are involved in crafting that kind of, how's this story going to be told? What's the pacing of the telling? Is the pacing such that it's lugubrious and too slow? Is the pacing too fast for people to really get into the characters? You have to be very careful in terms of the pacing of the storytelling as well.
Do you have any particular philosophies toward editing that you carry with you on every movie, or are you always shifting gears?
It really depends on the film. A lot of editing is musical, rhythmic. I would say
that's the best thing I've ever heard said about editing, is that it's musical and rhythmic, which is
it
what it
has,
is.
yeah, because it does pace the story as it's being told to the audience, and it takes your eyes where you want the audience eyes to go.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to show you the lamp, I can show you the lamp, and I'm showing it to you for a very particular reason for that film.
Assuming it's been shot.
Assuming it's been shot, yes. And if I want to, I mean, one of the things also, in terms of the rhythmic thing, I was an editor on a film called Yentl, which was a Streisand picture.
Indeed.
And there was Terry Rawlings, who was the main editor. I was another editor that Barbara brought on. And there was a scene in that film that I had been working on for a couple of days. It was a tough scene. And Barbara would come in, and she would look, and I would show her the scene. We had a cam, which is a flatbed machine where you have a screen on it, and you're running the film and the sound audio tape at the same time.
This was actual film footage.
Actual film footage. And I would run the scene for her, and she would look at it, and we would look at it again. And then she would turn to me and say, take 4 frames off of my close-up at the end. And I would take 4 frames off the close-up at the end. So you're talking about, 4 frames is like, I don't know, 3 inches.
It's a sixth of a second.
Right. And she'd come back and she'd look at it, put back 6. Anyway, we'd go like that for a while. But when she said, that's it, and we're really talking here about infinitesimal moments of a second, when she said, that's it, she was right. And that was a musical thing that she was doing. She was using her musical talent and her sense of rhythm and musicality to decide how long that close-up was supposed to be on.
Well, has anyone ever had more musical sensibility than Barbara Streisand?
Right. So, I mean, I that kind of confirmed to me that aspect of editing being a rhythmic kind of thing, as well as, you like to, particularly in action scenes and stuff, you like to take the audience's eyes from right to left to right. You want to keep them. So that's also another kind of aspect of editing, which is a kind of a visual painting of editing, which is you want to engage the eyes rather than have them be static.
Also, I assume that one of the editor's jobs is making sense of everything that's happening, so that it's not a hodgepodge of things that you don't know what's happening.
Ideally, ideally, yes.
Well, yeah, because you know when you're watching a bad movie because you can't figure out what the heck's going on.
What's going on? Yeah.
There are certain filmmakers that they shoot in a haphazard sort of scattershot manner, and then they edit in a haphazard scattershot manner, and you don't know what the heck's going on half the time.
Right. Yeah. No. And I think there's an interest now because the storytelling has changed now in many films, and a lot of filmmakers, they like to shake up the narrative steps that usually are more classical.
Structurally.
Memento and that kind of thing, the structure.
Pulp Fiction.
Pulp Fiction and stuff. They can go any which way, you know. And people are so visually literate today because of computers and videos and whatnot that people can follow that.
Well, people have become habituated to straight linear storytelling, so that when you go off that straight linear storytelling, they still know how to follow along.
Right. Yeah.
So would you say there are big differences between the approach to cutting a documentary versus cutting a narrative scripted film?
I would say one of the things I try to do as best I can is make them the same.
Make them the same.
When I'm cutting a documentary, I really try, depending on whether I have the goods or not, but you try to shoot it and cut it as if it were narrative storytelling.
How often have you brought into the story a piece of footage that was thought of to be an outtake or not viable at the time that it was shot?
Well, certainly footage that you wouldn't ordinarily want to show because it was either underexposed or shaky. I've certainly wound up using that kind of footage because the content of it overrode the quality of the cinematography.
Right.
But I don't know whether I can think of anything that was thrown out and then all of a sudden found its way back in.
Can you go into post and loop in a documentary, or would you not do that because then you're not being truthful to what was shot?
Yeah, no, you would not do that. I mean, you know, today because of phones and video cameras and whatnot, people are very forgiving in terms of the quality of audio. So you would probably most likely use the bad audio and subtitle it, then
Right.
go in and loop it.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Last question about editing. How late typically will you see a score come in? Whatever the music is it usually pretty late in the process, and that makes some kind of an impact on the movie, whether you have to recut or not, or is it always at a locked picture?
Yeah, you pretty much always want to try to make it a locked picture for the composer. Although, you know, certainly there are little thises and that you do editorially that might change, 8 frames here, 9 frames there. And you'll have to pass those on to the composer before he actually finally records the final score.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, your temp score that you've chosen is helping you get the length of the scene that you want it to be when it's scored. So you have that sense of this is what the scene is going to be like with music because you've temp scored it.
So I would say that pretty much all filmmaking, especially the production end of it, though post as well, comes fraught with various pressures, stresses and pressures. Do you have any particular technique for handling stress and pressure?
No, I don't. You?
I just try to breathe.
Look, one of the things that I found obviously is everybody, I mean, it's an artistic or creative endeavor, and everybody is anxious and nervous about their performance in that endeavor.
Of course.
Whether it's the gaffer or the grip that's pushing the dolly, or whether it's the actors who are performing. And so I didn't realize this when I was younger and I was working that's true for everybody. If Barbara were to come into the room, she has her own doubts about what she's seeing or doing or writing or reacting to. And so, that's one of the things that I, now as a older person, having been around for a while and been in the business for 40 years, it's much easier to relax about it because it's one of those things where you realize everybody's pretty much in that boat.
Right. You're not the only one who is having self-doubts, because everybody's having self-doubts.
There's no known. Is that light too sharp on the character, or should it be diffused more? I mean, there's nobody saying this is it other than the people who are there giving their opinion. And so as a director, you have to decide which, as a director, you initially marry the writer and work on the script. You divorce the writer and marry the cinematographer, and you divorce the cinematographer and you marry the editor, and then that, then they're all gone. You never see them again. But
unless it's incestuous in some way.
right.
Well, yeah, I would say that we're talking about truly the nature of art is that you're always going into an unknown. So you're trying to make something new out of what wasn't there. And therefore there's questions about it. How perfect is it? Well,
Right.
you're always trying to strive for some notion of perfection, whatever the heck that is. Because
Right.
the older I get, the less I know what perfection is, even though I'm a perfectionist.
Right.
So it's a kind of a weird thing to be an artist, especially in a collaborative medium like filmmaking, where other people are putting their 2 cents in constantly.
Right. And you want those 2 cents also, because it never ceases that somebody will have a good idea. Somebody will. I mean, there is something in terms of the collective discussion that does create creativity sometimes. There's sometimes creativity comes from going within and going away from everybody and coming it up from within you and finding it within you, what's the choice. But there's also committee creativity that can come about, and where one idea is topped by another idea is topped by another idea, and you wouldn't have gotten there without those people.
Well, many of the greatest filmmakers and artists of any ilk in the history of art will say that they wisely take advantage of whatever ideas are coming their way from whoever it is, whether it's the janitor or whether it's the cinematographer or the actors. It doesn't matter.
Right.
If somebody has an idea about something, you listen to it and at least consider it.
And then there's always the wise admonition of steal from the best.
Yes. What is it? How's that phrase go? Amateurs borrow, geniuses steal. Something like that. It's one of those things where the truly great artists are. We're all standing. Anybody who's ever had any success in the arts of any kind are always standing on what has come before. We're always standing on the shoulders of those who've come before. That's an old, cliche phrase, but that's true.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely.
What's come before sort of sets up what is to come in the future, and you have to kind of borrow a little bit or take, and unless you are the rare, true super genius who pushes the envelope into a whole new thing. Jeff, we've been speaking for an hour, if you can believe that, and we're gonna wind this thing down a little bit. And I'm just curious, in all of your experiences that you've had out there, can you share with us a story that's either quirky, weird, oddball, offbeat, or just plain funny?
Well, I don't know if it's funny. I mean, there have been many, many, many funny or strange things that obviously
Well, tell us one or two.
Over the course of these years. The one that comes to mind, which it was, so one of the things, not that long ago, maybe about 6 years ago or so, 7 years ago, I was asked to document Barbra Streisand's trip to Israel, where she was going to perform for the first time ever. She's never performed in Israel before, and she was going to put on, I believe, 2 shows in Tel Aviv. And while she was there, she was also going to get a degree at the university in Jerusalem, and she was going to also sing at Rabin's 90th birthday, I think it was. And I've been connected with Barbra since Star is Born, so it goes back quite a ways. And I filmed a lot of her and documented a lot of her stuff. And so I was very happy to do that. And I took a cameraman and hired some crew there in Israel. And I also brought along a prosumer camera that I had just gotten, good little Sony camera that I was going to shoot. So I had 2 cameras going. And we weren't really even sure what we were going to do with the footage, but Marty Ehrlichman, who has been her manager since she was probably 16, wonderful guy, great guy. He asked me to fly over there and shoot them, film them while they were there. Anyway, one of the days she was going to sing at Rabin's 90th birthday, and no, I'm sorry, not Rabin, Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres's 90th birthday. And before she was to go on, she was going to go into the green room. And she wanted me to film her while she was waiting to go on in the green room. And so she said, come get me out of my dressing room. And I said, well, I'll walk you with the camera. And she said, well, I don't want your cameraman there, but you can be there with your camera. And I said, okay. So I worked out the shot where I would kind of walk with her, dolly with her back as she's walking down this long corridor to wait in the green room.
Right.
And we get to the green room and the door is there with a bodyguard and or security guard, and he lets her in with her husband, Jim, and then she says, please let the cameraman in, and so I go in. And we walk into this room, and normal kind of green room with couches and chairs and stuff, but there are a bunch of chairs around, and in one of the chairs is Bill Clinton, and in another chair is Shimon Peres, and then Marty Ehrlichman, and this industrialist, Israeli industrialist, Saban, I forget his first name now.
I'm Saban?
Yes. And I'm wondering, what am I doing here? Why am I here? And then in walks somebody who says the prime minister and Sarah Netanyahu. And in walks the prime minister and his wife. And they sit down, and I'm there, standing there with a camera. And I have I don't know whether to, it's one of those classic things. Do I want to just sit there and listen? Or do I need to record this and film it? So obviously I filmed it. And it was one of those things where I had no idea what was going on as the filmmaker. I was just sort of led into this area, into this wonderful moment of these footage of Streisand and Clinton and Netanyahu and Perez all talking about pastrami sandwiches and whatever. I mean, it was just, delightful.
That's amazing that, that you get to be the fly on the wall.
Yeah, and totally by surprise. I had no idea what was going on in there. I just thought it was going to be a green room with a couple of bottles of water waiting for her to go on.
Was she not nervous before she went on? Was she not?
She's always nervous. She's constantly nervous. She hates performing in front of crowds. And
so how did she manage with that kind of, that's real stress and pressure. You're about to go out and perform. You're already someone who is concerned about your performance enough that you're a little bit on edge. And now you have to deal with all these major world leaders.
Yeah, it's, it was, for them, you had a feeling of a room full of alpha people.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were all pretty much, Bill Clinton was holding forth, and so was Netanyahu, and Barbara was holding her own. And so you had a sense that they were all pretty comfortable there.
This was past Clinton's presidency, obviously, yes?
Correct. Yes. This was just about, I would say, 6 years ago.
I see. So he was well into retirement, but he's a respected elder statesman at that.
He was, and it was all these statesmen came from around the world for Perez's 90th birthday.
Wow, that is that's one that you won't soon forget, huh?
No, it was. Not that funny, but
but it's a great story.
It was a big surprise.
All right, last question for you today. Do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip for those who might be trying to break into the business today, or maybe they're in a little bit but looking to get to the next level? It's quite different today than it was when you got in. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, a couple of things I would suggest. I'm a believer in before you try to get in or while you're trying to get into the business, try to get as many experiences as possible. Try to do as many things as you possibly can and know about as many things as possible and experience as many things, both in terms of work, in terms of personal relationships, in terms of, travel. The more you have experience, the more you'll be able to bring to whatever project you want to bring it to. That would be one thing, and which is not to say no to film school, but just one of the many things that you should be maybe thinking of doing. I think I taught school 4th and 5th grade before I got involved in filmmaking, And I think my experience as a school teacher was incredibly helpful, primarily on the set. Because you're, as a director on the set, you're kind of like a school teacher trying to keep everything under control and
Lots of children.
and have a good day out of it. Hope that the day goes well. The other thing we sort of touched on a little bit before, which is when we're talking about everybody's vulnerability and everybody's uncertainty, don't think that you know more than people. Let them think that you know more than them. You will probably, by being yourself and calling upon your best nature and your best understanding of things, you will impress people more than trying to impress people.
Mm-hmm.
I have found that the more you just are, I'll tell you a quick story that might be actually sort of funny. I had done a documentary about the making of A Star Is Born, where we went down to Arizona and filmed Barbara and Chris Christopherson on this concert they were giving as part of the film, and I made this documentary, and Barbara asked that she liked the documentary and she wanted some of that 16 millimeter footage that I had shot and edited to be in the film itself, the feature film itself, The Star Is Born,
Right.
as if Esther Hoffman, even though I shot her as Barbara Streisand, as if she were Esther Hoffman and the character in the film. And so one day I got a call and she asked if I could come up to her house and watch a 3-hour cut of A Star Is Born. Frank Pearson was the director, but she was going to screen the film with her then boyfriend John Peters and her very close friends, and Joan Ashby, who was Hal Ashby's wife. Joan was Barbara's assistant at that time, and would come to the house to see the film. And I was like, I'm going to go to the house, and I said to my wife, I'm going up there at 6 o'clock to see the film. She's going to show me this 3-hour film, and I was scared stiff,
Sure.
I had no idea what this was going to be like. And we went up there, and they served a little bit of food, and then they ran the film. It was a 3-hour cut, and lights came up, and then we proceeded to talk about the cut and about the film. And I gave my 2 cents, what I thought. I said what I thought about it, and this is sort of what I'm talking about. I did not try to impress. I wasn't trying to be highfalutin or anything, or try to imply that I knew anything particularly. I really responded like I would respond to a film that I went and saw in a theater,
Right.
and gave them my insights or my feelings about it. She really liked it. I mean, that started a relationship that still lasts today. I still talk to Barbara, and we still have a relationship. But I was not trying to impress, but it turns out that I did impress. And so I think there's something to just being the person that you are and believing in that, and not trying to do anything more than that. Very often when you try to do more, there's a certain kind of hubris that's involved. And I think a lot of people, particularly in the business, become wary of that, what might be false presentation.
You're correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying be you, be a natural you.
Be the natural you, but with the understanding that you'll probably get further by doing that than by trying to affect something.
I think that's extremely wise advice, and I think a lot of people try to affect things.
The end of that story is that we sat there talking about that film till about 1:32 in the morning. My wife knew that I had gone at 6 o'clock or 5:30 to see the screening. And when I walked in, I literally did the classic thing of taking off my shoes as I tiptoed into the bedroom, but she was wide awake waiting. So we laugh about that as
what were you doing up there at Barbara Streisand's house, right?
Exactly.
Well, Jeff Werner, this has been a spectacular hour plus.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
It's just fantastic to learn all this about your life, your experiences, and certainly documentary filmmaking and editing. So I can't thank you enough for coming on StoryBeat today.
My pleasure, and it's a real joy.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great Story Beat episodes to you. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.